The idea of the mind control, which of course the Germans originated in many respects, though of course the idea of mind manipulation goes back thousands of years. We won't go into that history of the cult manipulation and the long drawn out processes by which people can be manipulated, and has been going on throughout history. But in terms of the modern aspects of mind control, we're talking about taking a person, altering their memory patterns, altering their memory of their own history, and conditioning them, not only for false memories, but conditioning them to be available to work on a specific project or to do a specific thing on command, which command is also buried with access by some kind of a keying system, regardless of what the keying system is. That's mind control. Mind manipulation is to precondition the persons to be interested in certain things and not interested in others, to be accepting, let's say, of certain criteria in our modern society, to accept, let's say, the way our government is going, or any government is going, towards more and more legal and otherwise control of people and a civilization. To be accepting of certain things which the government would like them to be accepting of, that's mind manipulation. Mind control means that this person can be taken over and used for something which may be totally against their normal desires or their normal inclinations, but by means of programming their subconscious mind, unknown to the conscious mind, to be able to do something on command which otherwise they might never do, and which of course they have no awareness of their having been programmed to do this. Setting up a programmed individual, if you will, a programmed patsy, if you will, whatever, a person who is programmed to do certain things on command, and the command would be given, and of course under that program the person will do what they've been programmed to do, totally oblivious of their normal personality. This was the aim of the program experimentally at Montauk. Now, mind control can be used on general populations and be elsewhere, but in terms of Montauk, they decided to see if they could set up a whole cadre, a whole class of people who were programmed, pre-programmed or partially programmed, as the case may be, such as the two boys involved in the Columbine shooting. They were Montauk boys, both programmed, but at the same time they had, to some extent, an awareness of where they were going. And they were consciously setting some of this up because that all shows in the records they left in the computers that they were planning this sort of thing. That was not a case of totally buried and somebody else pulling the strings on them. Yes, someone else is pulling the strings on them, but they're also acting to a degree consciously. Programs operate inside programs, and they run through several levels of concealment, cover, if you want to use the term, of several levels of laundering. In this case, it's not laundering money, it's laundering people, if you will, for their usage. Who is setting it up? That is laundered so that nobody can really find out. First, one has to understand the basic mechanisms behind this. The research which led up to this kind of a program attempt was work that was done originally by Dr. Wilhelm Reich of Austria. He was a student, considered the prime and best student of Sigmund Freud. And of course he was over there prior to World War I. He did have quite a school going, and Wilhelm Reich was one of his principal students, and according to Freud, perhaps his best student. But Freud had some strange ideas. Wilhelm Reich, before he came to the U.S., spent about 2 years in Russia. He thought that the Soviet system might give him more freedom of thought and action in terms of his research. Freud encouraged Reich in his research, even though he didn't agree with it. He says, go ahead and do your research. He said, continue it. So he left the Soviet Union rather in disgust and came to the U.S. Lived in Long Island area, Queens, for a while. Then he set up his laboratory after the war was over in Rangeley, Maine, and started his research work up there. He acquired a CIA contract in 1947, the year that the CIA came into existence in a formal sense with a charter, for doing mind research. The CIA said they wanted a contract for him because of his reputation, and they wanted him to find out, is there any ways you can deprogram people and possibly make psychics more psychic, particularly with younger people, to make them more psychic. On the basis of that contract, Reich went ahead and did all of his research for it was a 5-year contract. But he came up with a very basic idea and a very basic formula, which is used essentially to this day. The programming of a person requires somehow you access their subconscious mind. That's been a fairly well-established fact for quite some time. They found that the people who were most easily programmable, most susceptible to all of this, were those around puberty, the beginning stages of sexuality. They were the most easily programmed. They found, whether it's by experience or whether it's from Reich, I don't know, that when you get up to the age of about 17, you start to develop a mindset of your own. You start to develop your own personality, which does go over into the subconscious, of course, so levels of conscious and subconscious personality. But at that age, you start to develop your own personality, and therefore this would interfere with programming. Therefore, they wanted to get the programmees at the age around puberty, which could be anywhere from 12 to 16. We'll have to add certain aspects of this. How did they get the intended victims? How did they get the Montauk boy programmees in the first place? Initially, they went out around Long Island and picked them up in a van at night, late, kidnapped them, quite literally, bring them in and say, we want to use you for this program and so forth. But then, of course, you get to the point, I want to go home. Well, you're not going to go home. They could use a number of techniques on them to try to bribe them. In some cases, kids were bribable. In other cases, of course, they refused. They locked them up. Then they would threaten them. And then, of course, if they passed the other requirements, which, of course, they had to have a physical screening, they had to have a psychological screening, they had to have an IQ test. That threw quite a few out. But picking up from families along Long Island, wandering around the streets at night and so forth, quite a number of them would pass the IQ test. There's no problem with that, because the basic IQ requirement was 100, which is to say average. Some of them would be resistant right from the beginning. Others would go along with the part way, and others would go away along with this apparently all the way. But those who resisted, if they saw that they were a good candidate, they didn't want to lose the candidates, because in the early stages, they were rather hard put to get a candidate. Not like later on, but they were rather hard put to get a candidate early on. So you pick up these kids here from people on the island, who many of them are wealthy, have a lot of connections, and they have clout. I says, you're going to have problems. It's going to be in the press. Apparently they're able to control the press to keep it out, number one. Number two, possibly they paid off the families if the families really started to get anywhere in the investigation. But I think in most cases they were able to divert investigations to dead-end it. I'm hypothesizing in that aspect because I don't know how they kept it quiet, very frankly. Later on, with electronic techniques, it was a little different. Well, this physical programming technique didn't sit too well with a lot of them, and even when they did accept the programming, quite a few of them wound up dead. At times, with certain kids, will produce an enormous backlash in the nervous system to the extent that it's so enormous it kills them outright. And this is what happened to some of them. Nobody could explain medically fully why, but it did happen. So, one more dead body to get rid of. Typically speaking, the young kid asks, how would you like to travel in time? If they understood what it was all about, they'd probably think it would be a great thrill, a great thing to do. In today's language, it would be very cool. They didn't all come from Long Island. See, that was the initial part of it, was they pulled the kids off of Long Island. Then they started pulling them out of New York City, where there's a lot of kids on the streets that had no homes left. Then it transferred to, well, let's go after the homeless kids. Somebody, I don't know who, made the suggestion, why not pull some of these street kids off from some other part of the country? Because literally you could use the tunnel to go up to that and do a scouting number, pick some potentials, somehow trick them or whatever into getting to the vicinity of the tunnel. They get sucked through the tunnel to Montauk, and they're there. Well, how they treated them from that point on was up to the management, but they were beaten into submission essentially if they didn't go along with it until 1979. It was the new system was electronic because it was found with a lot of medical experimentation and lab work that you could induce the same state in the individual for programming electronically. I estimated some 10,000 kids, maybe 20,000 kids have been run through the program up through 81. Maybe by 1981 it was around 10 to 20,000, but I think it was more now in view of what I know now.